afternoon and welcome to Examining IoMT Vulnerability Management and Incident Response, a Health System CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Asimily. Just a little housekeeping. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health System CIO, and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You could send in your questions or comments at any time in the Q&A box. We'll take those later in the program. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first we're going to go about 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Sanjeev Shah, VP and CISO with Centura Health, Paul Curylo, CISO with Inova Health System, and Shankar Somasundaram, founder and CEO with Asimily. And then we will have our Q&A. So let's jump right in and get started. Lots of important stuff to talk about. Sanjeev, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Anthony, thank you so much. Nice to be with you and the panelists. I serve as Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Centura Health. Centura Health is a healthcare system, largest in Colorado and also presence in Kansas, providing whole person care to people and communities we serve. We have about 17 hospitals, 10 subclinics, soon to be 20 hospitals with a couple of acquisitions that we recently announced. So yes, we are in taking care of people in Colorado and Kansas and surrounding areas with services that we provide as a healthcare organization.
Very good. Thank you, Paul.
Good morning. My name is Paul Curylo. I'm the CISO for Inova Health System. We're located in Northern Virginia. We have 5 hospitals and 3 urgent care centers serving America's finest here near the Capitol, where we focus on primary health care, serving the community we have the honor to serve. My main duties are focused around, of course, protecting the organization from cyber threats, improving cyber hygiene. So really look forward to having the conversation today around that topic.
Very good, Paul. Thank you. Shankar.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shankar. I'm the CEO of Asimily. Our focus is really around inventory, cybersecurity, and operational management of medical and IoT devices, exclusively focused on healthcare. And we are working with health systems across the country.
All right, very good, Shankar. Thank you. All right, Sanjeev, we're going to start with you on this. How do you define IoMT? Figure if we get some definitions in here, it's a good place to start.
Yeah, we think of IoMT as Internet of Things. There are medical devices, essentially connected devices that really are critical component of how we provide care and how we serve our patients, but also these devices present unprecedented challenges. So with definition, that's how I define it. Looking forward to hearing how my colleagues would further expand on that.
Paul, thoughts?
Yeah, in today's medical care environment, we are connecting more and more devices in different ways to the network, or using network technologies to increase communications between devices. So whether it's a pump, a wearable, a component of a fixed machine that has to communicate, this mesh of communications is meant for one purpose, and that is to improve patient care, patient outcomes. And the desire is to ensure that these devices can speak efficiently with other things. So where in the past we were pretty comfortable with general compute devices on the network, now going forward, we really have to look at the vast array of different operating systems, communications protocols, and purposes for these devices on essentially the same network. So when I look at IoMT, I'm thinking that just about anything could be considered a medical device and will probably be connected at some point to the network.
Shankar.
I would say, so that's that part of going last. I think Sanjeev and Paul have already covered it pretty well. But I think the one thing I would add is, while the focus with IoMT is a lot on the connected medical device, and like Sanjeev said, on the critical care, and like Paul said, the diversity, there's also a big element of supporting devices in IoMT, which people forget, which you generally may not classify as IoMT, but it is as much a part of the medical network as any other device. So for example, think of that server, which effectively stores patient data, and the imaging device needs to talk to it to get some of the commands to actually operate. While that server in general might be classified as a server, for all practical purposes, it's a key supporting device in the entire medical device network. So I would say while IoMT does cover these medical devices, critical care devices with diversity, there are some sets of generic, what you would call maybe generic purpose devices that are vital to the essential operation, whether it's a workstation or server, of this medical device, which do store PHI, which transmit PHI, which doctors use, which are required for the operation on the network, which you could broadly encompass in the IoT network as well, because without them, the IoT, the network probably will cease operation or will have adverse effects as well.
So Shankar, that's why definitions are important, right? Because if you're not including those supporting devices in your definition of what you're trying to secure, do you think you could actually leave them out of the way you're trying to protect these IoMT devices if you don't think of it in the larger sense that you're describing? Have you seen people sort of leave these out of their plan?
So that's an interesting question, right? I mean, we work with around 1,800 healthcare sites today, and it's a wide variety. I think there's a lot of differences in maturity across organizations. There'll be some, if you talk to someone like Paul, Paul has a high level of sophistication, he gets it, but there'll be some who are still nascent in their program. And they would say, oh no, that's the server, that's on the IT workspace server side. We don't really worry about it. Like we only focus on the ultrasound and the pumps. And the challenge with that approach is, long before a decade ago, when I started looking at these problems in healthcare, somebody told me, healthcare is not a set of devices, it's a system of systems. And that's how I define healthcare. It's a system of systems. You have a system of systems where different devices interoperate and work with each other. The challenge that happens is if you really want to look at it, whether it's from an inventory, cybersecurity, incident response, any perspective, you have to account for these, I would say, core supporting devices, because an attack, a threat, an incident could all originate from there, then hit your core critical devices, and that could be a problem. And remember, I used to run the IoT business at Symantec many years ago, and when the Target attack happened, Target had actually, this is public knowledge now, but Target had effectively reached out to Symantec to run a post-mortem analysis on the incident. And then I had a red team that had done the post-mortem analysis. And one of the things we found is, and this is public knowledge now, that time we had discovered it, the attack came from a power supply, which was vital for the ATM to function, right? And that would be called a core supporting device, and not incorporating it into the overall environment definitely was a problem in the overall thinking. So I would say if you don't incorporate them, I think you would leave gaps in your environment.
Very good stuff. Very good points. All right, next question. Paul, we're going to start with you on this. How do you define vulnerability management? And is vulnerability management more difficult when it comes to IoMT?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. And the short answer is yes, it is more difficult for a lot of various reasons. Part is our approach to vulnerability management in the perspective that we start from. But defining vulnerability management, really, this is about understanding an organization's threat posture, because not every vulnerability should be a concern within your organization. Otherwise, you'll drive yourselves crazy trying to stamp out every vulnerability. So this is the management part, and that is characterizing vulnerabilities with respect to the environment and the impacts that it can have on the environment. Also not an easy endeavor. It does take a dedicated team to work on this, but it also takes partnership with various system owners and system custodians so that there's good general knowledge of what the threat exposure looks like. So even a simple information disclosure vulnerability, which may rate very low, might actually turn out to be something of more concern if it's revealing the wrong kind of information. So vulnerability management really is around characterizing the vast array of vulnerabilities against an organization's threat posture.
So would you say sort of a step one is you need to inventory and identify all your vulnerabilities, and then there's a ranking that goes in to decide which are the most serious, and then what are we going to do about each one of these that we want to address?
Yes, and that's usually where it goes off the rails, right? Because you stop at step one and you have to identify everything. So everybody stops at step one and waits until they've got everything identified before doing anything else. And that generally just leads to failure. You do have to identify, but it should be a cyclic process to identify and incorporate, because we won't have perfect visibility on everything all the time. And the next step, of course, is coming up with a set of criteria or capabilities to evaluate new and existing vulnerabilities for their impact on the organization. So it really has to be a series of cyclic activities. It's not a single one step, get to the end and you've reached a stasis and now you just put it on autopilot. So it does, and again, that speaks to the management piece. It does require management to ensure that that process is robust. And it is a challenge. It's a challenge in the healthcare environment because we have so many different types of devices and their exposures vary based on the complexity or maturity of those products or their communication stacks.
Yeah, great point that you can't get stuck on step one and sort of never move beyond that point because you're never done creating that inventory. And we hear that a lot in so many areas of IT and security and other areas, which is a lot of people's number one piece of advice when we talk about tackling any kind of thing is just get started. You just get started, just don't get caught up in planning. Sanjeev, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, let me first acknowledge, Shankar made a really wonderful point, which is we do have to think about IoMT as the ecosystem of systems and applications that connect, which all together present different sets of challenges within the context of our conversation today. And Paul is absolutely right. The challenges are, we don't really have all the information needed about devices, right? Manual data collections are prone to gaps, errors, inventories are incomplete. And this is a problem really across the industry unless we have adopted a methodology by which we're looking to solve this problem. It's harder to understand device relationships, right? Then tracking and managing and protecting them is even more difficult. Essentially, operational efficiencies and the gaps that exist can be exploited by attackers or can simply be problem to errors or system issues that can result in outages or safety issues for patients from biomedical devices. So really, when we look at, for example, overall ecosystem that we have that surrounds the IoMT landscape, in that we find platform vulnerabilities to be the most significant gaps. Application vulnerabilities come second. And IoT vulnerabilities themselves are probably a small third, and everything else is probably 1 or 2%, like a firmware update. So really what is really needed here is a good visibility, right? To discover and profile any connected device so that we have automatically maintain a comprehensive up-to-date inventory, right? That's one. Then we got to have good insights, right? Analyze risk to stay safe and operate efficiently. And operate efficiently also means managing vulnerability efficiently in the manner Paul talked about it earlier. You got to understand your devices, you got to understand the type of vulnerabilities they have and have the right context. Most importantly, I would say, somehow we have to be able to detect anomalies in the entire ecosystem and the landscape of assets we're talking about. That cannot be a manual effort. Manual efforts are absolutely not good enough to be able to manage the level of threat and vulnerability that exists. So data-driven management and security decisions become critically important. I'll pause there to see what my colleagues would add to what I've shared.
Shankar, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think great points from Sanjeev and Paul. So I have a couple of things. So one is obviously from vulnerability management, like purely it's the entire process of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediation, mitigation, right? That's the entire process of vulnerability management. And if you look across those five or six steps, right, it is more difficult in IoMT because if you look at the identification process, you have so many legacy devices in the environment. You can't just go scanning all of them. Many of them won't even tolerate a scan, they'll crash. If you look at it from a classifying and prioritizing, it's more challenging in IoMT because if you go look at like on an average, like we have seen like over a month, you can have 2,000 vulnerabilities, 3,000 vulnerabilities getting published. Last year, that was the average. And then a manufacturer publishes one patch for every good manufacturer, maybe one every 50. I mean, some of the manufacturers are one every 1,000. So you don't have enough patches coming out. If you look at it from a remediation and mitigation perspective, people fall back on segmentation. The segmentation, I mean, I've been in networking for 20 years. Segmentation doesn't always cure the problem. And then once you segment it, maintaining that over, let's say, 3 years or 5 years can be an enormous challenge. Segments start well and become flat over time. I almost call every segment a flat segment, like a flat network. Everything becomes a flat network. So that creates enormous challenges in IoMT because you can't scan many of these devices. You don't really have enough patches. These are very complex systems, so you can't just segment them out. And if you segment them, you bring in more devices on a monthly basis, and suddenly your network becomes flat within a year, and you don't even know which devices with what segment anymore. So there are fundamental challenges. And then to add to it, one important point that Paul also mentioned: take that information disclosure vulnerability, right? On an average, like you say, an information disclosure vulnerability, what is the risk? But if you go back to the system of systems point, in healthcare, it's even more important to think of vulnerabilities as a chain of attacks rather than a singular point in time. Right. And so they have this attack vector and attack chain they talk a lot about in MITRE and so on. It becomes even more critical to think about that in healthcare because an information disclosure might not be impactful on its own device. Like you probably don't have enough data to steal on an infusion pump anyway. But through that, you can use that as the launch pad to go steal data from a server. And so the system of systems that also Sanjeev alluded to, that creates a second level of problem in healthcare because these vulnerabilities now can be exploited in ways that you normally wouldn't see, right? But there are benefits in healthcare that are not there in other environments. And so if you look at it from an exploitability perspective, what we have seen at Asimily, if you take like 1,000 vulnerabilities, I would say 90% of them would not even be exploitable in a given environment. What I mean by exploitability is, can an attacker take advantage of that vulnerability in that environment? And our analysis shows consistently, if you do that kind of exploit analysis, feature looking, 90% of them would not even be a concern. And what the 90% it would change from one environment to the other. You got to do it on a per environment basis. But if you do that environment-specific analysis in an automated way, you'll find that most of them are not really a problem. And then if you do some prioritization based on impact, in healthcare, there is a benefit because of the way the devices work that you can really prioritize on a critical few. And then if you do the anomaly detection that Sanjeev mentioned, then you can further prioritize. So there are some benefits to healthcare. Sorry, guys, go ahead.
You just blew my mind. There was a tremendous amount there. Yeah, a really interesting point. So you're saying 90% of the things you find are not going to be a big problem. 10% are. But those 90% will change depending from one organization to the next, correct?
Yeah, even from one facility to the next, sometimes you see variations within the same organization on what vulnerabilities have a problem, because it does depend on the way the device is connected, what it's connected to, what are the surrounding devices, how is it being used. There's a lot of factors here. And that's what attackers try to take advantage of, right? The same vulnerability, they try to attack different environments differently because every vulnerability has its own exploit vector, and that changes from one environment to the other.
Well, let's keep talking about this. Anything you want to touch on? Sanjeev painted Shankar painted a pretty daunting picture. You can't scan a lot of these devices because they're too delicate. Segmentation may not be as wonderful as some people make it out to be. It sounds quite challenging. Talked about patches, and he talked about the fact that some of these devices in and of themselves don't seem like they have a lot to offer other than as a pathway to get into the system of systems. So it's a pretty daunting picture. Your thoughts?
Yeah, when we implement countermeasures, we're thinking that countermeasure is going to cover a lot of ground. And sometimes it starts by covering quite a bit of ground, maybe not completely, but sometimes it starts by doing that. Segmentation is one of those. But over time, we punch more and more holes into that segment. We create more and more avenues of approach. And before we realize it, we're back to a near flat environment, but with the complexity of maintaining all the rule sets to try to give the appearance of segmentation. So that creates complexity that needs to be managed. But more importantly, it's about understanding the pattern of life of the machines that are running in our environment, the relationships they create, the dependencies that exist, and having an ability to see what that map looks like, and then ask subject matter experts who care for those systems about those situations, so that anomalies can be detected. And Shankar had mentioned this. So anomaly detection is particularly important, whether it's an outlier or a change in the pattern. That's particularly important because that's something new, and that new thing could be just normal, could be normal operations. Maybe we implemented a change in a system and that didn't flow to the cyber team. Or maybe it's a threat actor who's established a beachhead on our pumps and is looking for other more lucrative targets. We won't know until we address the anomaly. So that gets particularly important, and that's really where, having an inventory is great, but we know inventories are static and sometimes they have holes. But it's the relationships between the devices that become really much more important in an environment like that. I like to see segmentation in an environment, but where segmentation has gotten overly complex, it's now defeating the purpose. It takes more management to maintain the segmentation and customer experience than the value we're getting from creating the segmentation in the first place. So there is a balance here, and it's different for every organization. Just as the vulnerabilities that present will have a different impact on organizations. So it sounds very daunting. It almost sounds like, every organization will have a unique program tailored to their specific environment. There are some commonalities in that, but by and large, the threat exposure varies based on how an organization has approached this communication conundrum.
Sanjeev, we talked about detecting anomalies and how important that is, and you mentioned that cannot be a manual type of thing. That's got to be automated. Anything else you want to discuss around that, or anything Paul said?
Yeah, what I'm hearing from my friends is that it is a unprecedented challenge, in managing threats that surround IoMT devices and landscape. Although, we need to employ an approach that gives us an advantage, gives us a defensible posture. And to be able to do that, I think we've discussed some of the basic concepts that can be leveraged. One is simply having a clinical cyber hygiene. Network segmentation do give us an advantage in terms of defensible posture, although we all agree that's not enough. So let's kind of think about it in terms of, why are we trying to manage these assets, and why are we trying to manage vulnerabilities, right? There are a couple of things that go through our viewpoint, and I reckon my friends will agree, which is one, we're trying to prevent any catastrophic damage caused by cyber threat that takes out or disrupts patient care operations, because these devices that belong to a certain network segment or a flat network are no longer available in the ecosystem. The second way of thinking about the risk itself is a harm to patient because of a malfunction or lack of availability of a device, either because you had a network issue or you have a device issue, and maybe it was caused by a patching event. my point simply is that there are big issues we're trying to resolve from an operations perspective, but we're also trying to address patient safety risks that may be a bit more localized, when we talk about these IoMT devices. So if you think about it in those perspectives, we need to think about what safeguards can you employ to prevent that damage from occurring in the manner that you would if we didn't have the defensible posture. So I don't think we ought to let go of network segmentation, because what that does, it limits the damage to a certain segment if you have a problem. And no, it's not enough by itself. That's why you have to employ other techniques within that safeguard posture. That includes just managing hygiene of these devices, for example, and meaning managing the vulnerabilities associated with that. And how we go about doing that, we can employ a risk framework. We can look at a risk score, simulate that, have an orchestrated vulnerability scanning that doesn't disrupt operations of these devices, and have a remediation recommendation similar to what Shankar talked about earlier, which is a bit more programmatic, and you have a better lens of which vulnerabilities you manage that gives you the best advantage. And then when we talked about the different types of threats and how you safeguard against them, well, imagine a world where you know about your devices, you have good information for them, and you have a good tracking and management for it. Well, now we can manage network policies with that visibility of the infrastructure that we didn't have earlier. We can then reduce device risks and by strengthening that security posture. So the rules that we're talking about in terms of segmentation are no longer static, but they're more of a dynamic network policies that go on to address these risks. And then that advantage you can translate into having meaningful meaningful integration with partners that serves the overall ecosystem, and then gives us all a better defensible posture. So I would like to promote the concept of better defensible posture than having some absolute security posture that is hard to achieve, I'll admit, with IoMTs.
Paul, I see. Go ahead, Shankar, and then we'll go to Paul.
And I think Sanjeev made a great point, right? I would say if we up-level this entire discussion of vulnerability management and broadly call it risk management, then I would say, how do you define risk management, and vulnerability management becomes an aspect of it. Then segmentation, dynamic segmentation, integration, prioritization, everything can fall under it. And then you can choose to do it depending on what your organization needs the most, right? So then the problem appears less daunting because you're reducing risk. Sorry, Paul. I didn't want to.
No, that's all right. So, spot on, absolutely spot on. We're in the business of trying to make patient care easier and delivered when needed by the clinicians, right? The other aspect of that is to increase the costs of those that would look to abuse those systems. And that's where we've got software-defined networks, profiles, segmentation, the countermeasures that we bring to bear. We'd like to believe we can stop every threat, but that's not going to happen. But what we should be doing is making it costly enough that somebody who would consider abusing the network decides that it's not value add to them, and they look elsewhere, they go elsewhere. That's really the right thought, I think, in terms of crafting good countermeasures. They need to be good enough that the cost of abusing systems is just not manageable for the threat, right? Because if unless they're that terribly determined, they're probably not going to stick around for very long. So I have lots of conversations with system owners and with our vendors just on that point. I know we can't get to perfect. I know that some of the devices just simply don't have those capabilities built in, but what can we do to make them less of a target? So, eliminating services running on devices that don't need to be there, for instance. Those are the discussions that I'm having now with biomedical manufacturers and other IoT manufacturers. So I certainly welcome the dialogue, because in a lot of cases, the dialogue just simply hasn't been there.
Paul, I think I would add, this is an area that's evolving, right? The use of IoMTs are ever increasing. The demand for the assets for clinical care is in ever so more. Not all organizations have the management of these assets centralized in a way that we can be most effective in terms of the security of it. So there are lots of challenges, but you make a good point. You just got to get started with knowing your inventory, managed versus unmanaged, and then to Shankar's point earlier, employing approaches that then gives us a risk management approach in how we look at these devices and assets.
Shankar, anything you want to add there?
I think we covered it all. Yeah, I would say I think we covered it all. I think the last thing I would just say is, when it all appears daunting, right? The fundamental characteristics of the devices, like I said, allows you to prioritize a lot more than you would be able to do with IT workstations and servers if you look at it carefully, because of the way they are used, the way they are purposed, the way they are connected. So when you actually look at the details, the problem might not be as daunting as it appears initially. And you might be able to prioritize and focus a lot better than you would be able to do with IT workstations and servers.
Anthony, maybe I'll add something else. Shankar just reminded me of this. Earlier I mentioned that platform vulnerabilities, at least, when we look at our landscape, account for 65% of vulnerabilities. Application vulnerabilities are probably 30%. And IoT vulnerabilities maybe 5-6%, and everything else, like firmware accounts for remainder 1 or 2. So the challenge is still with platform vulnerability, application vulnerability, largely speaking. And I don't want to forget the point Shankar made earlier. It's about the ecosystem. So platform vulnerabilities are something that is even harder to address when it comes to IoMT devices, because some of them have gone through FDA approval process, certificate process, and so changing the nature of that asset isn't as easy. So I think we got to remember, what type of vulnerabilities are typically present when we think about the ecosystem. And again, our ecosystem is one flavor, and one facility to another health system could be very different. But I think that lens is very important in terms of what approaches we can all adopt in terms of risk management of it.
And Sanjeev, just for the audience, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's a really good point, and really incorporating the discussion, risk into the discussion with our business partners, our clinical partners, because we may come to the decision point that the particular device and the purpose that it serves just brings too much risk to the organization. That has to be a comprehensive discussion, though. That can't be a IT decided we can't use a thing. That's not going to work. We need to understand what that particular piece of equipment does and what value it brings to patient care, because we might adopt a riskier position even if we can't apply appropriate countermeasures because of what it does. The ECMO machines are kind of an example of that, although I don't have anything specific with those. But ECMO machines were kind of important here in the last couple of years. So we weren't going to shut any of those off, regardless of what was going on with those machines, right? So those are the kind of decision points I think we need to elevate to a broader discussion and include our business partners as well.
Paul, that's an interesting point. And could you tell me more about, because 10, 15 years ago, security was not speaking with clinicians, right? I mean, that wasn't happening a lot. Now it has to happen. There has to be discussion between security executives and clinicians, where security executives are describing the risk situation created by a particular piece of medical equipment and explaining it in the best non-technical IT terms they can to get across the situation. the clinician is going to respond and try and describe in the best terms they can to you the value that device brings to the work they do.
Right.
Someone ultimately has to decide whether or not that risk is going to be accepted. I'm not sure if that is the chief medical officer who's going to say, well, I'm willing to take all that risk on because we need this. Can you tell me more about how that dynamic might actually play out?
Certainly. So it depends on the gravity of the situation. We've had some of those decisions go right up to the top, and we've had cabinet level discussions about certain aspects and certain risks. Some of those risks are kind of a lower level type risk, and that might be, say, a service line or site of care discussion. Is this the right direction for us organizationally? So it starts by having the conversation. And I do rounding in the clinical areas, and I talk with nurses and nurse managers and directors and others in the care space, just to circulate and take some feedback and have the discussion from just from a human perspective about the challenges that they're facing. And from there, that may develop into a larger risk discussion around cameras is another one. NICU cameras, rather important during the last couple of years because of the isolation measures that were implemented. Well, NICU cameras, or cameras in general, are generally pretty easy to knock over, but it's providing a much needed service. In this case, new parents can see their infants, especially if they're in the NICU, right? So those are the kind of challenges that we should be seeking to resolve, not find a better camera or you can't have this device connected to the network. That doesn't solve any problems. The problem to solve is, well, how are we going to ensure that parents of newborns in the NICU can actually see their newborn, because they can't go in and hold their newborn, right? That's the more important discussion to have with our clinicians and our business partners.
And Sanjeev, I think that's a very interesting dynamic that is taking place, is that security executives must truly understand the workings of the health system to the device level, must be comfortable having really back and forth engaging conversations with clinical leaders to, again, present the risk and understand the value. And then again, that ultimate decision process can go in any number of directions, but you have to be comfortable as a security leader to get to that level. Is that correct?
Anthony, you make a wonderful point, and it's absolutely correct. In the manner that we approach the topic of cyber risk, and then IoMT is a component of that, is we take a multi-pronged approach, right? We have a governing body that is a combination of very senior level executives. We have an operations focused security council that brings together not just the technical minds, but also operational leaders into that conversation. And we highlight risks around security at a level of depth appropriate at each level of conversation to bring insights and seek inputs. And we work on this issue in a very collaborative way, similar to a point that Paul very artfully made. The business that we are in is to care for our patients and the experience and supporting families. And the use case that Paul referenced of a child and childbirth, or a care of a child, and where we need families' interactions, I think first and foremost, what we try to do is think about clinical workflows, technology innovation, cybersecurity innovations that can go on to support and enable that. That is our on the forefront. What we don't let go at the same time is ensuring that safe and secure operations ultimately deliver the patient care that we all envision, and also do it in a way that is a safe operation. So both of those governance model aspects are extremely important. Also important is The part when a new device comes into the environment, we actually perform a technical evaluation of it to ensure it is architecturally fit for our ecosystem and landscape. And we don't say no to every asset necessarily, or say yes to all assets. What we do is employ a risk-based model that says, if we go ahead and employ this asset because it has tremendous value for healthcare operations, then what we do is we try to provide a mitigation approach in how that device or asset can then be adopted into the system. All that to say is, it is a collaboration with our CMIO, our CNIO, clinical leaders, but also technical partnership to make the right decision every single time for our organization. And when we do it collaboratively, we ultimately end up achieving better outcomes. Again, this is not something that we always had. This is a process that has evolved over the years. And in the last, I will say, 12 to 24 months, we've gained some momentum and proper ground to have the kind of discussions and the kind of deliberations and kind of outcomes that I know my friends and colleagues also desire.
Shankar, so what we're hearing is obviously the reasonable approach from reasonable CISOs, which is we're not the Department of No, but we are here to make sure that the organization doesn't take on more risk than it wants to. But I would imagine you've also seen some organizations that are still not bringing in the CISO and security personnel at the beginning of the process when they start looking at product. And then the security team has to play catch up and then sometimes play the bad guy because this was just unacceptable. Like, we can't even make this thing better. This one's too risky. You shouldn't even have looked at this. So you're seeing the gamut? Are you seeing the gamut from organizations that bring security in at the beginning to organizations that are not even bringing security in until security happens to hear about it? Is that still going on out there?
Yeah, very much. I would say, you have the entire spectrum, right? You have organizations which effectively where the CISO is a key decision maker in whether we should buy a device or not, to organizations who say the CISO is an influencer, but sometimes clinical needs override, during the pandemic, clinical needs rightly in some cases override any other need. And so you take that into account, you put mitigating controls in place, but you can't make that as a primary decision. I've seen that. Whereas I've seen organizations who are saying, you know what, why do we even care about security? Let's worry about security later after we deploy it. And the problem is when you do that, you're always playing catch up. You already discussed all the challenges with existing devices. Now you bring in new devices, and now the CISO or the security organization and even the medical device risk officers, they're constantly playing catch up, because on an average, we have seen health systems are churning 15% of their devices every year. So you add 15% to a large inventory, existing inventory. You got to solve it at the problem. And it's amazing that, Sanjeev, Paul, you guys are already looking at it. You're obviously one of the more advanced CISOs in the industry, but there are many out there who probably think of it as a future problem, whereas you can't really separate that as a future and current. They're all part of one big problem, and you got to address them as a whole.
Yeah, Shankar, I think the point that you made there is a journey, right? We all have to start somewhere. And not all of us have had an opportunity to start a journey at the same time. But I think deliberate effort and intentional collaboration are two really important pieces to ensure security has the right seat, right voice, but also has a business mindset and context to serve the organization well. And I think all of those come together, and it comes together over time. It doesn't happen just because we want it one day. I think that's the point that I will make. And I invite all security practitioners and leaders out there to think of this as a journey to make the ultimate progress that we all desire to make.
Great point.
Shankar, how would you describe the level of clinical knowledge and familiarity that you need to have to be a successful CISO? How much do you need to understand about what goes on the clinical side? You don't need to be a doctor. We're not saying that, but you have to have some clue of what this stuff does. And maybe it's something you learn over time, but it's got to be an interest of yours, right? I mean, you have to be interested in the workings of these devices.
So I would say, there's so much nuances to medical devices in this environment that it's very hard. And the CISO has so much security technologies. Every day there's a new security technology. It's very hard. A CISO's hard role, and we have two CISOs, so I don't have to talk to them. It's fundamentally a very hard role because you have to keep track of the security technology, keep track of threats, understand your own landscape, and then convince your board that everything you're doing has an ROI associated with it, right? I mean, it's a really challenging role. So in this kind of environment, it's very hard for a CISO to know the nuances, and knowing something half and at a very high level may not help. So I think the bigger, more important thing is to have a collaborative and partnership and be willing to listen with other key stakeholders in your organization who probably understand this really well. And like you said, I think it's the curiosity and the interest that's more important than the knowledge. Because if you have that interest and you have your right partner, and if you're willing to listen, then I think at the right moment, you can find the person in your organization, and there should be people in your organization who know something about the device, something about the capability, what you should look at, and really get that information to really solve it. And I think that's a CISO is more of a facilitator rather than the knowledge base is how I see it, who facilitates the entire action and who's willing to listen, absorb, and then transmit rather than just know everything all by yourself. I think that's going to be extremely challenging.
Paul, and I think what I'm trying to get at, it's when you talk about the rounding, the importance of rounding. I think that's the kind of familiarity I'm talking about, is to understand what's going on in the hospital. Maybe not to the device level, but you tell me. I mean, how's your knowledge of what these things do that you're securing?
Yeah, so the device level is important, but you can't go. I don't do rounding from the perspective of I'm going to learn about devices. It's more of a kind of an accidental knowledge game when I'm doing that. What I'm really doing there is understanding what the clinical workflow is, what services are we delivering, what challenges to delivering that service actually exist. Because the people I'm speaking with in those situations largely don't understand technology at all, except from a consumer perspective. And we didn't hire them to understand technology really at all. We hired them to do patient care. So it's really, that effort is really about bridging the gap and learning. So one of the key aspects, I think, to being a successful CISO is you've got to want to learn. And one of the things you need to learn is, well, how do hospitals and health systems operate? And so that's really the key aspect there is to engage and be willing to learn about what's happening in that space. And that's true with any sector that a CISO is actually serving in. But more so, I think, in the healthcare space, because it is so dynamic. We're looking for innovations in care, not so much innovations in technology. Innovations in technology can increase innovations in care, but it's really innovations in care that the clinicians and the physicians are really interested in.
So Anthony, Shankar and Paul have just made us CISOs really human and real, and we are not ever claiming to be all knowledgeable about everything, right? I think that's where really the important part is. We may come up with different types of how we grew into our CISO roles, and so it's really important to surround ourselves with teammates that go on to further complement gaps that we may have as individuals, but still able to serve the full context of the CISO role. Second part that is even more important, and both Paul and Shankar have alluded to, being able to have the right conversation with your stakeholders to either promote better security, advocate a case, or saying as sometimes a very hard, difficult thing that this particular proposition has enormous risk to the organization, and here's why. What I have found in all my experience, and as I've been growing myself in my own CISO role over the years, is that you find colleagues who are receptive, willing to listen, and willing to lend support in how best to address and manage that risk. And it's rare where somebody wants to take on risks that are really not good for the organization or good for patient care operations that we're all talking about.
Very good. All right, I want to jump in here with the audience question. We have two audience questions I want to get to. I'm going to read it. I think one of the biggest challenges in IT security always comes down to the personnel in the organization and educating the non-IT coworkers on their role in network security. An example could be a medical device that has a USB port, and the unsuspecting coworker decides to use that port to charge a cell phone or an iPad and opens the network to vulnerability. How are you educating non-IT personnel of your organization on the role that they play in security? How effective do you think that education is for your organization? Paul?
Oh yeah, there's a variety of methods here. The go-to is the annual training, which that serves a purpose. It's a compliance check block. Yeah, we do that. But its effectiveness is next to nil. I've actually changed our program entirely. So we do quarterly trainings, targeted focus trainings, but we do so much more. We have this communication we call the 5 and 5. So occasionally we'll have a spot there during roundings, interactions between team members. So we're always promulgating the message, talking about security aspects as opportunities arise. What I find is we're human. As humans learn, they learn best at the point that information is most impactful. So as I'm rounding, if I am seeing behaviors, we'll have a discussion around those behaviors and why that's bad practice. That also means that you have to be rather present in order to see those kinds of things, and then encourage others to have the same conversations. Probably the single force multiplier I currently enjoy is my peer group is actually promulgating the same messages that I've been promulgating here for the last 2 years. And that's refreshing. I come into a meeting or I hear by a side story that that one of my peers is pushing on a particular agenda and has shared information around cyber risk that I didn't prompt. And that's a refreshing view, I think, because it's not just me carrying the message; it's all of us in a leadership position carrying the message.
All right, one more question. I'm going to give it to you, Sanjeev. The use of an IoMT solution, such as Asimily, allows the exploitation of the computerized maintenance management software in use by your clinical engineering team. How are you using this opportunity in your facilities? Have you integrated your IoMT tool with clinical engineering CMMS database for better clarity in identifying medical devices and vulnerabilities found on the network?
Yeah, another great question. I'll go ahead and admit that our journey of using an IoMT solution is fairly new. And so we have employed the technology solution that gives us a full perspective on our assets in the landscape, what vulnerabilities exist, what our remediation approach and plans are. And we are developing integrated processes with clinical engineering, IT, and even business owners of those assets to facilitate more regimented, understood, workable process that the question really alludes to. We are not where we want to be in terms of the efficiency of it or even the optimization of the process. Nevertheless, we do have the clinical engineering as well as IT working together on assessing and managing risk associated with IoT and IoMT devices as they come into our environment going forward. But we do have a historical set of assets still to manage in the way that we've been talking about so far.
All right, I'm going to do a lightning round of final thoughts. We're almost out of time, so I'd like to get a final piece of advice from everyone for your CISO colleagues who are dealing with this IoMT challenge. Paul, let's start with you. Final piece of advice.
Be flexible, enlist partners to help carry the message, and get out there in the healthcare environment and talk to folks. Think about the last time you've actually been in a unit talking with folks. So that would be my advice, is just get out there and engage, and the rest of it will start to make sense.
Sanjeev?
Yes, similar to what Paul said, just being very operations business centric in approach of how technology and cyber ought to enable and transform patient care operations and capabilities, as well as experience. But keeping in mind that cybersecurity is equally important, especially in our roles as CISOs and cybersecurity practitioner, and methodical approach to solving for that problem over time is the right approach. There is no silver bullet, but a defensible posture gives us an opportunity to defend operations, protect our people, and most importantly, safeguard care to our patients.
Very good. Shankar, we'll give you the final word.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take a line from what Sanjeev said. The entire thing is a journey. And so what I would recommend is not be daunted by the challenge. It's a challenging thing, but not be daunted, and start somewhere, work through the steps. And ultimately, it's a risk management problem. So every step you take is bringing down the risk in some measure. And if you keep at the journey, I think you're going to reach a very strong posture while improving the overall organizational efficiency as well.
All right, very good. That's about all we had time for today regarding continuing education. You could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for upcoming webinars. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel, Sanjeev Shah, Paul Curylo, and Shankar Somasundaram. And I want to thank Asimily for sponsoring this event, and thank you for attending. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.